Story 1. The Possession of Roland Doe. The true story behind The Exorcist. In January 1949, a 13-year-old boy, pseudonym Roland Doe, lived with his family in Maryland. After his beloved Aunt Harriet, who had introduced him to Ouija boards, died, strange phenomena began occurring around the teenager. The family initially noticed scratching sounds within their walls and floors. Roland's bed would shake violently at night, and objects would reportedly fly across rooms. Religious objects, particularly crucifixes, would vibrate and fall from walls when Roland entered a room. The first sign of direct possession manifested when red scratches appeared on the boy's body, forming words and symbols. The marks would appear suddenly, with witnesses watching them form on his skin in real time. The family sought help from both medical professionals and their Lutheran church, but Roland's condition worsened. He began speaking in deep voices unknown to his family, displaying knowledge of languages he'd never studied, and demonstrating impossible physical strength. During one incident, a heavy wooden bed levitated while Roland was on it. Multiple priests documented that Roland would react violently to holy water, even when it was disguised in regular water. During one exorcism attempt, witnesses reported that words like hell and evil spontaneously appeared on his body like welts. The final exorcism ritual lasted 3 days, during which Roland broke a priest's nose and tore out another's stitches with superhuman strength. Objects flew around the room, and temperatures dropped dramatically. The boy spoke in multiple voices, some ancient, some demonic. After more than 30 exorcism sessions, the possession finally ended when Roland suddenly jerked upright and declared, "He's gone." He had no memory of the events, and later went on to live a normal life, though he never spoke publicly about his experience. Story 2. Anneliese Michel, The Tragic Reality. In 1968, 16-year-old Anneliese Michel from Leibelfing, Germany, experienced her first convulsion. By 1973, she was suffering from depression and hearing voices that told her she was damned and would rot in hell. Initially diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, Anneliese underwent psychiatric treatment. However, religious objects began burning her, and she couldn't enter churches without experiencing violent reactions. She developed an aversion to holy water and claimed to see demonic faces during prayer. The first signs of multiple entities emerged when different voices began speaking through her, including Judas Iscariot, Nero, Hitler, and Lucifer himself. She would describe smelling an overwhelming sulfuric stench that others couldn't detect. Her behavior became increasingly disturbing. She ate spiders, coal, and bit the head off a dead bird. She would perform hundreds of squats and prostrations daily until her knees bled. Witnesses reported seeing her eyes turn completely black during episodes, and her face would distort into impossible expressions. During exorcism sessions, which were recorded on tape, multiple voices would argue with each other through her. She spoke in languages she never learned, including ancient dialects. Her body would become so rigid that even several strong men couldn't move her limbs. The exorcisms continued for months, during which Anneliese refused food and water, claiming the demons wouldn't let her eat. She endured 67 exorcism sessions, each lasting up to 4 hours. Her body was covered in bruises from throwing herself against walls. Tragically, Anneliese died of malnutrition and dehydration in 1976. The tapes of her exorcisms still exist, featuring voices that audio experts cannot explain. Her gravesite reportedly experiences unusual phenomena, with electronic equipment often malfunctioning nearby. Story 3. The Enfield Poltergeist. In 1977, single mother Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children in Enfield, London, began experiencing what started as a typical haunting, but evolved into something far more sinister. The focus seemed to be on 11-year-old Janet Hodgson. The family first noticed furniture moving on its own and knocking sounds in the walls. Janet began speaking in a deep, gravelly voice belonging to Bill Wilkins, a man who had died in the house years before. She could accurately describe details of his life and death that she couldn't have known. Investigators and media witnesses observed Janet being thrown from her bed by invisible forces. The voice speaking through her demonstrated knowledge of historical events and personal details about visitors that Janet couldn't have known. During interviews, Janet would switch between her normal voice and the demonic one mid-sentence. Medical experts observed her levitating and being thrown across rooms. Photography and video evidence captured objects moving on their own, and Janet speaking with her mouth clearly closed. The entity speaking through Janet challenged priests and investigators, revealing personal secrets about them that were later verified. Janet would sometimes snap into trances, displaying impossible strength and speaking in multiple voices simultaneously. The possession intensified over months, with Janet being found inexplicably on the roof of the house and furniture stacking itself in impossible configurations. During one recorded session, Janet was thrown with such force that she broke a police officer's camera. While Janet eventually recovered, she maintains no memory of speaking in the voices or performing impossible physical feats. The recordings and photographs from the case remain some of the most compelling evidence in paranormal research. Story 4. Clara Germana Celi, the Levitating Nun. In 1906, at St. Michael's Mission in Natal, South Africa, 16-year-old Clara Germana Celi, an orphaned student, allegedly made a pact with Satan. What followed was one of the most well-documented cases of possession in church history. The initial signs appeared when Clara became unable to tolerate religious objects or enter the chapel. She displayed knowledge of the private sins and thoughts of those around her, including visitors she'd never met. She could speak and understand multiple languages she had never learned. Witnesses reported that Clara would make animal sounds, barking like a dog, neighing like a horse, and making sounds like a pig. These weren't imitations, but perfect replications that zoologists confirmed were indistinguishable from the real animals. During the possession, Clara demonstrated superhuman strength, throwing nuns across rooms with one hand. She would levitate up to 6 feet in the air, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, often requiring several people to pull her down. These levitations were witnessed by hundreds of people. The most frightening aspect was her ability to read minds and reveal secrets about people she'd never met. During exorcism attempts, she would speak in voices that priests recognized as ancient demons mentioned in theological texts. 2 priests performed an exorcism that lasted 2 days, during which Clara levitated so high that her head touched the ceiling. She screamed in multiple voices and displayed knowledge of future events that later came true. The temperature around her would drop drastically. After the successful exorcism, Clara returned to normal with no memory of the events. However, the room where the exorcism took place reportedly remains unnaturally cold, and students report hearing multiple voices when it's empty. Story 5. The Perron Family Haunting, Inspiration for the Conjuring. In 1971, the Perron family moved into a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, unaware of its dark history involving multiple suicides, murders, and the witch Bathsheba Sherman, who had sacrificed her infant to Satan in the 1800s. The family of 7 initially experienced typical haunting activity: doors opening, objects moving, and strange sounds. However, Mother Carolyn Perron began showing signs of influence from a malevolent entity. She would go into trances and speak in a different voice. The first direct encounter with Bathsheba's spirit occurred when Carolyn was slammed into the ground by an invisible force, leaving a perfect circle of bruises around her head. The children reported seeing apparitions of people who had died on the property, but Bathsheba focused her attacks on Carolyn. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren documented Carolyn speaking in languages she didn't know and displaying knowledge of the property's history that wasn't public record. During investigations, recording equipment would malfunction, and temperatures would plummet to impossible levels. During one particularly violent episode, Carolyn was possessed and thrown across the room while speaking in Bathsheba's voice. She revealed details about past murders on the property that were later verified through historical records. The entity would physically attack the family, leaving scratches and bruises. The situation culminated in a failed exorcism attempt, where Carolyn levitated from her chair and spoke in multiple voices simultaneously. The Warrens reported this was one of the most violent cases they'd encountered, with physical attacks on everyone present. The parents lived with the entity for 10 years before finally leaving the house. Today, subsequent owners report continued activity, and Bathsheba's presence is still felt. Items connected to the case in the Warrens' Occult Museum reportedly remain supernaturally active,